2024 is going to be a completely different year in college football for a ton of different reasons, right? The college football playoff is expanding, but not only that, you have coaches like Jim Harbaugh and Nick Saban no longer in the sport, but maybe most importantly, you have a lot of changes in conference affiliation. The Pac-12 dead and gone. You have teams moving. Arizona State, Utah, Colorado moving to the Big 12, Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA moving to the Big 10, and then Texas and Oklahoma out of the Big 12, moving to the SEC. There are seismic changes going on in college football. And with all of those conference changes, I wanted to go back and look at what does the first year in a new conference look like for programs that have done it over the course of the last 10 to 15 years or so. And so I went through and kind of dug through the data, and I think it's really kind of interesting to take a look at, one, schools that move from Power 5 to Power 5 conferences. So back when Colorado, Nebraska, Missouri, Texas A&M, Maryland moved from the ACC, Big 12, into the Big 10 SEC, fared a little bit better than schools that were moving, and maybe not unsurprising, moving from schools that were in the American or Conference USA or what have you, the Big East, to what is now Power 4 football. But I want to go through kind of case-by-case basis and look at those numbers. So in 2011, Colorado and Nebraska left the Big 12 and joined the Pac-12 and the Big 10, respectively. Colorado went from 5-7 in the Big 12 to 3-10 their first year in the Pac-12. So a noticeable, I think, drop. Meanwhile, Nebraska went 10-4 their final year in the Big 12 and then went 9-4 their first year in the Big 10. And that's, there's nothing really super interesting, exciting in those numbers until you start to get into other numbers. In 2012, Missouri left the Big 12 to join the SEC. They went from 8-5 in the Big 12 to 5-7 in the SEC. Now that looks like a big drop, and you could automatically say, yeah, that's what playing in the SEC will do to you. Well, one, they played for the SEC championship the exact next year. So it wasn't this gigantic drop-off from the Big 12 to the SEC. A&M had the kind of exact opposite reaction to when they joined the SEC. It says 6-6 in the SEC. That's wrong. They were 6-2 in the SEC in 2012. They went 11-2 in conference. They went 11-2 in their first year, and they go 6-2 in the SEC. Now it's pretty much been one of their only real highlights in the SEC. Johnny Manziel wins the Heisman Trophy that year, so things went pretty well for A&M. But then you look at the final two schools in this situation. TCU was in the Mountain West. They went 11-2 in 2011. And then in 2012, they go 7-6 in the Big 12. And it's a similar story for West Virginia, 10-3 in the Big East. Now, I know at that time we considered the Big East a Power 5, and at that time it was an automatic qualifier, was the kind of terminology used for the BCS at that time. They're 10-3 in 2011. And they go 7-6 their first year in the Big 12. Now, I know, and going back to, we talked about that this was viewed as a power conference, that this was a automatic tie-in to the BCS. That last year of Big East football was West Virginia, Cincinnati, Louisville, Rutgers, Pitt, Connecticut, South Florida, Syracuse. If that were a conference today, would we view that as a Power 4 or Power 5 conference? I think the answer to that is no. I think it's hard to say that a conference of Louisville, Cincinnati, Rutgers, Syracuse, Pitt, UConn, Temple, South Florida, West Virginia. I think it's really difficult to say that is a power conference, because they are. So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them are now in power conferences. But I don't know by any stretch of the imagination they're viewed as the bread and butter blue bloods of those Power 5 conferences. So I think you lump in 2011 Big East with and you could probably argue 2011 Mountain West is better than 2011 Big East, but I don't feel like rehashing 15-year-old stories. But it is interesting that you look at 11-2 for TCU in a group of 5, 7-6 in a Power 5, 10-3 for West Virginia in a group of 5, 7-6 in a Power 5. I don't think that's necessarily a coincidence. And this next one in 2013, teams that went to power conferences might be the most surprising because Rutgers 6-7 in the American Athletic Conference. And then in 2013, they joined the Big Ten. They go 8-5. And I know that the perception that Rutgers has been absolute trash in the Big Ten. And believe me, I think there are portions of that are 100% warranted. But when you go to they went 8-5 their first season, and then after that, things did not go well under Kyle Flood and then Chris Ash. But I think it's important to point out, like, hey, they were 8-5 their first year. Now their conference record stays essentially the same in the Big Ten as it did the AAC, but it's a pretty cool thing to look at and say, like, wow, Rutgers went 8-5 in the Big Ten in their first season. And Pitt didn't have a whole lot of change from the Big East to the ACC, 6-7 to 7-6. I think you can draw some conclusions to a couple, and it gets more abundantly clear when you get to the Big 12 in 2023. One more. Maryland went 7-6 their last year in the ACC, 7-6 their first year in the Big Ten. Louisville went 12-1 in the American, 9-4 their first year in the ACC. Again, there's not a ton of that you can draw from that. If you want to argue, like in the American did argue, right, that it's a Power 6, baby. It's not the Power 5, it's the Power 6. And we're like, if you have to make the case that you are in that group, you're not. But they did, and you see kind of a bit of a small drop off where you go 12-1 in your last year in the conference to 9-4 your new year and your first year in a new conference. But 2023, and there is a long dry spell there where you don't see any changes in the Power 4. You see relative stability for damn near a decade. And then with Texas and Oklahoma leaving for the SEC, USC and UCLA leaving for the Big Ten, those announcements, then came dramatic shifts to the Big 12, where 4 teams that were part of the American are called up to the Power 4. And BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF rise from the ranks of best of the rest to part of this new exclusive club that anybody in the group of 5 is lying that they would say they would do literally anything. SMU was foregoing TV deals for 7 years to call themselves a member of this group. Everybody is doing whatever they can to join that exclusive club. So these 4 schools did it, and the results were not good. When you look at BYU goes from 8-5 as an independent to 5-7 in the Big 12. Cincinnati goes from 9-4 in the American to 3-9 in the Big 12. Houston, winning record at 8-5 their last year in the American, 4-8 in the Big 12. UCF, 9-5 their last year in the American, 6-7 in the Big 12. You can look at that. Like, it's objective. They are numbers. You can see that there is a jump from the group of 5 to the Power 5 at that time, now the Power 4. Now, there are some, you can give some caveats there, right? Like Cincinnati 2023 is a first year under a new head coach. There's bound to be some drop off there. Houston fires Dana Holgorsen after a 4-8 2023 campaign. UCF has been not quite up to what they were under Scott Frost, But Gus Malzahn is an experienced, really good football coach. But moving to a new conference, moving to a more difficult conference in 2023, the results are a drop-off. So you can see from those numbers that jumping from the group of five to the power five is somewhat viewed as a challenge, especially in the first year for those programs. But the schools moving from power four to another power four, or from a power five, RIP Pac-12, to the ACC or Big 10 or Big 12. And I forgot Stanford and Cal moving from the Pac-12 to the ACC this year. There's not that gigantic drop-off that you might expect. So I talked earlier in the week about Texas and Oklahoma might need to be careful what they wish for by joining the SEC, because there's only so many places that you can be the top dog, right? Like, there are only so many teams that can be viewed as the 1,000-pound gorilla. And Texas and Oklahoma, for a very, very, very long time, have enjoyed that status. And when you lose that status, looking at you, Nebraska, Miami, Penn State to a lesser degree, when you lose that status, it's somewhat like an existential threat to your football program, because people aren't used to not being the top dog. And I think it's something that Texas and Oklahoma fans are going to have to think about, look at, view over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. And it's the same, I think, for USC fans, Oregon fans, that you're not going to go into the Big Ten and be at the level that you probably were in your old conference. It's something, like I said, Nebraska has had to deal with. Miami, Florida State for a time had to handle that as well. But it's also not the drop-off that you might expect. Did Mizzou have a rough first year in the SEC? Yes. But on the flip side, Texas A&M had its best year in 100 years, its first year in the SEC. So if you are a fan of those programs, Stanford, Cal, Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA, Arizona State, Colorado, Utah, that is moving from Texas, Oklahoma, moving from one Power 4 conference to another, I don't think you got a whole lot to worry about in your first year. But that's just what the numbers show. Want to hear from you. What do you think about your school's first year in its new conference? You can hit us up in the comments below. Want to hear from you. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode here of the Daily Huddle.